In this video, we move into the 79th question of Prima Secunda of the Summa Theologia. We're still in the treatise on bad habits, evil habits, which are vices and sins, all the way to question 89. And then we'll get into the law and then grace and merit. And then we'll be done with Prima Secunda and halfway through the Summa. So thank you for journeying through the Summa with me. And this, for these four articles in this question, have to do with the external causes of sin. And in all four of these articles, St. Thomas Aquinas identifies in what respect is God the cause of sin. Okay, so God is basically the subject of all of these articles. And in the first one, he says, well, whether God is the cause of sin. Does God cause us to sin? And you might be able to anticipate this answer, but of course the nuances and the way Thomas is going to explain it is pretty interesting. He says man is in two ways a cause either of his own or another's sin. And the reason why he's talking about man first is that he's setting up the stage for talking about God by comparing it to our own experience of man. He says, first, directly namely by inclining his or another's will to sin. Okay, if we incline our will to sin, well, then we're a cause of our own sin, right? Secondly, indirectly, namely by not preventing someone from sinning. Okay, we don't do what we need to do to prevent somebody from sinning. And then he says, now God cannot be directly the cause of sin, either in himself or in another, since every sin is a departure from the order which is to God as the end. Okay, so how can God, impede us from our end, which is him? It doesn't quite make sense that he would do that, right? Whereas God inclines and turns all things to himself as to their last end, as Dionysius says, so that it is impossible that he should be either to himself or to another the cause of departing from the order which is to himself. Now, this in and of itself is quite encouraging because it shows that God never ceases drawing us to himself. And he does this in a lot of different ways, through grace, the sacraments, the gift of the Holy Spirit, the virtues, theological virtues primarily, right? And so he doesn't cause us to sin, just the opposite. He draws us to himself. Therefore, he cannot be directly the cause of sin. In like manner, neither can he cause sin indirectly, for it happens that God does not give some the assistance whereby they may avoid sin, which assistance, were he to give, they would not sin. Okay, so sometimes he doesn't give exactly what somebody needs to avoid sin, but he does all this according to the order of his wisdom and justice, since he himself is wisdom and justice, so that if someone's sin is not imputable to him as though he were the cause of that sin, even as a pilot is not said to cause the wrecking of the ship through not steering the ship unless he cease to steer while able and bound to steer it, it is therefore evident that God is no wise the cause of sin. So either directly or indirectly, God is not the cause of sin. Article 2 says whether the act of sin is from God. Now I find this article really interesting, a little bit confusing, because Thomas is going to come down and say, well, yeah, God is the cause of the act of sin. See if it makes sense to you. He says the act of sin is both a being and an act. And in both respects, it is from God, okay? Because every being, whatever the mode of its being, must be derived from the first being, as Dionysius declares. All right, so with being, we get into existence, ontology. This is a very popular topic that many philosophers have focused on through the years. I think of Martin Heidegger and how much he was focused on being. And, Georg Hegel was very much interested in this as well. Existence, being, ontology is very much an important topic in philosophy. Again, every action is caused by something existing in act, since nothing produces an act save insofar as it is in act, and every being in act is reduced to the first act, that is God, as to its cause, who is act by its essence. So I guess if you remember the proofs for the existence of God, we had first cause, first mover, And the way he explained that is if you keep going back and back and back, you're going to get to the unmoved mover, the uncaused cause that kind of got everything started in the first place. Therefore, God is the cause of every action insofar as it is in action. But sin denotes a being and an action with a defect, and this defect is from the created cause, that is, the free will, as falling away from the order of the first agent, God. So God gets everything in motion, and then somewhere along the line, because we're given free will, we might choose through an act of the will to depart from where God is trying to guide us to go. Consequently, this defect is not reduced to God as to its cause, but to the free will, even as the defect of limping is reduced to a crooked leg as its cause, but not to the motive power, which nevertheless causes whatever there is of movement in the limping. Accordingly, God is the cause of the act of sin, and yet he is not the cause of sin because he does not cause the act to have a defect. Okay, so a little confusing, but then again, much of the Summa you really have to, reflect on and pray about in order to understand it. Article 3, whether God is the cause of spiritual blindness and hardness of heart. The reason I put this picture up here is because I think of that story in the Old Testament in Exodus about God hardening the heart of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh, and all the plagues come because he won't let the Israelites flee, and all that. But it says that God hardened his heart, and it's like, well, what's that all about? Why would God harden somebody's heart? He says spiritual blindness and hardness of heart imply two things. One is the movement of the human mind in cleaving to evil and turning away from divine light. And as regards this, God is not the cause of spiritual blindness and hardness of the heart, just as he is not the cause of sin, as we just learned in the last article. The other thing is the withdrawal of grace, the result of which is that the mind is not enlightened by God to see aright, and man's heart is not softened to live aright. And as regards this, God is the cause of spiritual blindness and hardness of heart. So sometimes God will remove his grace, pull it back. And it might seem kind of uncharitable on God's part to do this, but as we'll learn, especially in the next article, is that he has a purpose in his divine justice, that there's always some good that he has in mind that might result from this, right? Now, we must consider that God is the universal cause of the enlightening of souls, even as the sun is the universal cause of the enlightening of bodies, though not in the same way, for the sun enlightens by necessity of nature, whereas God works freely through the order of his wisdom. Okay, now, although the sun, so far as it is concerned, enlightens all bodies, yet it be encountered by an obstacle in the body, it leaves its darkness, as happens to a house whose window shutters are closed, although the sun is in no way the cause of the house being darkened. Okay, so the sun shines, but somebody may decide to close the shutters of the house, and so they've blocked the sun. That's what he's getting at here. Since it does not act of its own accord in failing to light up the interior of the house, talking about the sun here. And the cause of this is the person who closed the shutters. On the other hand, God, of his own accord, withholds his grace from those in whom he finds an obstacle, so that the cause of grace being withheld is not only the man who raises an obstacle to grace, but God, who of his own accord withholds his grace. In this way, God is the cause of spiritual blindness, deafness of ear, and hardness of heart. So God does sometimes pull back. He pulls back his grace because of our disposition, for whatever reason. He can do that. He's God, right? These differ from one another in respect of the effects of grace, which both perfects the intellect by the gift of wisdom and softens the affection by the fire of charity. And since two of the senses excel in rendering service to the intellect, sight and hearing, of which the former assists in discovery, sight, and the latter in teaching, hearing, hence it is that spiritual blindness corresponds to light, heaviness of the ears to hearing, and hardness of heart to the affections. I got to admit that last paragraph didn't make complete sense to me, but you know what? when you're dealing with something as big as the Summa, you just got to keep on moving. Everything's not going to make sense. Article 4, whether blindness and hardness of heart are directed to the salvation of those who are blinded and hardened. He says blindness is a kind of preamble to sin. Now, sin has a twofold relation to one thing directly, that is to the sinner's damnation, to another by reason of God's mercy or providence, that is, that the sinner may be healed insofar as God permits some to fall into sin, that by acknowledging their sin, they may be humbled and converted, as Augustine says. Okay, Augustine was one of those people. Therefore, blindness of its very nature is directed to the damnation of those who are blinded, for which reason it is accounted an effect of reprobation. But through God's mercy, temporary blindness is directed medicinally to the spiritual welfare of those who are blinded. So sometimes God might blind or harden a heart in order to bring that soul closer to him, right? And it appears that's not always the case, but sometimes that is the case. This mercy, however, is not vouchsafed to all those who are blinded, but only to the predestinated. Okay, so now we get into this very, very challenging teaching that Thomas has in the Summa about predestination, to whom all things work together unto good. Therefore, as regards some, blindness is directed to their healing, but as to regard others, to their damnation. Okay, so again, I'm not going to get into a big discourse about predestination, but there's a whole video about that somewhere months ago, and I encourage you to go back and listen to that one. All right, that's going to do it. Question 79, the external causes of sin. To what degree does God cause us to sin? Thanks for joining me. God bless you.